In November of 2007, Final Fantasy XI would get its fourth expansion, Wings of the Goddess. The next couple years following this expansion's release, the development philosophy behind Final Fantasy XI seemed to have fundamentally changed. Rather than delivering an expansion and working on it till completion, the amount of content Wings of the Goddess was getting slowed to a crawl. Usually, the life cycle of an expansion only lasted about 2 years before a new expansion came out. However, 2 years after the release of Wings of the Goddess, Square Enix began making announcements for their brand new MMO, Final Fantasy XIV. While 11 would continue to get new content, it was in the form of smaller add-on scenarios. The release of the 6th and final add-on was only a couple months after the launch of Final Fantasy XIV, and it seemed that all of the developers' attention was now directed towards the new MMO. It was widely understood that Square Enix was done with 11, and they could congratulate themselves for a job well done for what they were able to accomplish during the game's most vivacious era, all the while directing players away from 11 and into 14. This attempt to redirect players away, along with the changes made throughout the add-ons, resulted in the biggest exodus that 11 had ever seen. The community that the game had built up throughout the 2000s had been significantly diminished. It was getting very little new content, and the developers had their sights on the future of another MMO. This is not the end of the story of 11, though. 5 years, 6 add-ons, and one catastrophe of an MMO later, Square Enix announced a new final expansion for 11. This expansion was meant to deliver a brand new story, a wealth of new zones, and it was meant to further modernize the game. Seekers of Adoulin was meant to be a proper beginning for Final Fantasy XI's end. However, in hindsight, it's become hard to deny that Seekers of Adoulin was actually something completely different. This expansion was indeed the end of 11 as it was known, but it was also the beginning of something very special. The story, gameplay, and music convey this feeling of a new beginning in a way that the game has continued to maintain even today. You might think, how could this, the last full expansion of a game, truly be a new beginning for it? Admittedly, this topic isn't as simple as it is controversial, but by the end of our discussion, you'll know exactly what I mean when I say that Seekers of Adoulin was in fact a new beginning for Final Fantasy XI. August V. Adoulin, one of the most powerful men to have ever lived in Vana'diel, repelled the Velk forces out of eastern Ulbuka and founded a city, the city of Adoulin. Once the city was founded, he and his 11 generals went on a conquest to subjugate the mystical jungles of Ulbuka in order to guarantee the city's sustainability. During this campaign, they encountered countless horrors and threats to the existence of this new city. None of these obstacles had any chance of stopping this conquest, however. You see, August Adoulin wasn't just a powerful man, he was a force of nature. The first great obstacle he came up against were the Guardians of the Jungle, the most powerful of all creatures found therein, the Naquals. Even the combined might of these magnificent creatures proved to be ineffective at quelling the king's ambition. After many harsh battles, the king was victorious, and the Naquals swore their fealty to him. This wasn't the end of the king's conquest, however. It was hardly the beginning. On one fateful night, a new enemy launched its attack on the king. This new force was made up of horrid, abominable creatures, and they not only threatened the 12 warriors, but also the very well-being of the jungle that the monarch was trying to conquer. This was no longer a battle for their lives, but for the land as well. The king cut down their enemies one by one with no struggle, but for every one of these otherworldly creatures he vanquished, another took its place. As the night waged on, the enemy's forces had lost countless from its rank. However, it showed no sign of letting up. The king realized that the power of this new foe wasn't to be taken lightly, not because of the strength of its minions, but due to the unfathomable size of its army. As the story goes, while the morning may have broken at the end of the night, for the king and his generals there was no end in sight. They continued to battle day after day, pressing ever onward into the fray. For every step they dared to take ahead, they left the jungle behind them stained blood red. The countless days of fighting fostered the king's consternation until they found the source of their enemy's rank, massive ruins of otherworldly creation. The king and his comrades did gather their might. They were to enter the ruins and put an end to this blight. But inside, they found the monster, whose terror was greater than the conquerors had ever seen with their eyes. And the following night, they met their demise. The only one in that group who didn't die inside those ruins carried the final words of King August back to the city. Whatever it was they discovered in those labyrinthian ruins, it scared this powerful king, this force of nature, so thoroughly, his last decree was for the city gates to be shut, and for no denizen of Adoulin to ever step foot in the jungles of Ulbuka again. This was done so that no one else would be unfortunate enough to happen across the unholy abomination that destroyed the king and his men. Many years later, the city of Adoulin is so starved for resources, the only way for it to continue supporting its population is by violating the Founder King's final decree by opening the gates. This is needed so that they could try to utilize the resources in the rich and hostile, mystical jungles surrounding them. Towards these ends, the city decides on hiring pioneers from the Middlelands, and this is where you come in. As you pick up more notoriety as a pioneer, you're properly introduced to the story's main character, Arciela Adoulin, who serves as a figurehead princess for the democracy. Arciela spends much of her time in the Forbidden Jungles because of how much she dislikes the political division caused by the pioneer movement. As a consequence, she learns about the nefarious forces that have been festering unnoticed deep within the jungles. Arciela's character arc does a great job at guiding the player through all of the important information within this story. Her desire to positively impact Adoulin, despite her lack of influence, is how the adventurer is introduced to the political turmoil within the city. Her tendency to run away from political conflicts and into the jungle is how she and the adventurer learn about the dying world trees. The story weaves her character development into the developments of the central conflicts. This tremendously cultivated her sense of relatability, introducing the continent of Ulbuka to the player at a pace that doesn't ever feel too overwhelming. This second point is particularly important because this expansion contains almost as much world building as does all of the previous expansions combined. There is so much world building, in fact, that even though you learn about much of the world through Arciela's arc, the story still relies on info dumps occasionally. While some dislike how disjointed the added lore in this expansion feels from the previous stories, I personally loved it. It truly cultivates that feeling that you're in an adventure all over again. During my time with this expansion, many of its attributes have become iconic. The lore and design behind the Nake walls are just as memorable as the avatar designs of the game, and they would continue to be used for several content pieces in the future. I found the lore behind the world trees to be deeply fascinating, and there are so many other examples of phenomenal lore added in this expansion. While Arciela wasn't the only likable character from this expansion, she is the only one with a character arc this compelling. As for the other big characters within the story, while each one of them are among the most likable characters in the entire game, none of them experience any deep, compelling development. I found this to be particularly unfortunate because I really did like each of them. One character that did not disappoint, however, was the primary villain of this expansion. Any writer knows the importance of properly presenting a villain. The initial hours of this story go to great lengths to set up the Founder King and just how powerful he is. He seems almost mythological in his power and omnipotent in his accomplishments. After several hours of building this character up, you learn of how the king died inside the Rakazner ruins at the hands of something. Every bit of reverence and admiration you had for the Founder King instantly transforms to dread and fear for this main, mysterious antagonist. While I still think Lady Lilith is the best antagonist in the game, this expansion offers some genuine competition. This is in large part because so much of the story is written to revolve around this villain, even if you don't know it initially. The story starts slowly, with so many mysteries, and as you slowly unravel them, the tension builds. The stakes become higher, the conflicts become deeper. All of this is accompanied by phenomenal pacing that just leaves that sense of mystery and dread hang in each and every scene. The story ramps up, it continues to build and improve until Balamor. Balamor is one of the lesser antagonists in the story, and while his scenes are enjoyable, it's pretty obvious to see what the writers were going for. Balamor is essentially Eleven's version of Kefka, imitating his animated movements, his tenuous grip on proper situational etiquette, and even his own special laughing sound effect. Saying that Balamor isn't as good a villain as Kefka isn't much of a criticism though. Kefka is one of the best villains in the Final Fantasy series. The reason Kefka is so good, however, is because of the contrast between his character and literally everything else in the world of Final Fantasy VI. He is the only nihilist in a world going through an existential crisis, and it takes the entirety of Final Fantasy VI to explore that contrast. Balamor, on the other hand, is introduced once you've progressed considerably into the story. He is enjoyable to see on screen just like Kefka, but all of the best parts of Kefka, the way he serves as a foil for the main characters, the way he subverts the theme of the game, none of this is present in Balamor's case, and I ultimately feel that the amount of screen time he got doesn't justify his inclusion. While discussing this with another player, they made mention that the original intention for Balamor was to be far more integral to the plot of the main villain than he was. This one conversation about Balamor led me down a long and sparsely informed rabbit hole that, in my mind, makes Balamor emblematic of the issue that I have with the final act of the story. After the initial launch of Final Fantasy XIV, the reception to Square's new MMO was underwhelming, to say the least. So much so that this is the only Final Fantasy game to date that they have issued a public apology for. Rather than looking at how MMOs had developed throughout the years, they decided to make a second MMO in the style of Final Fantasy XI. It had worked for them before, why wouldn't it work for them again? After it became apparent that Final Fantasy XIV would go on to be the worst flop in the mainline series, they decided to relaunch the project. But there was one problem. They hardly had any capital to rebuild the project from scratch. What I'm about to say is almost entirely speculation, so take it with a grain of salt. There is an overwhelmingly large sentiment among 11 players that this expansion was Square's last attempt to squeeze every last penny they could get out of the game in order to supplement the budget of remaking Final Fantasy XIV. They hired ambitious developers whose passion for the expansion was palpable, but it seemed that when 14 was relaunched, funding was cut, and the last section of this expansion had to be rushed. Provided this is true, I don't think those resources went to waste. 14 will go down in history as one of the best Final Fantasy games ever made. Having said that, there is something clearly off with the final chapter of this story. Right after I began editing this video, an interview with the expansion developers was published. They confirmed many of the rumors that I heard regarding a whole new endgame zone and an entirely additional chapter that had been planned for the expansion, but was ultimately cut due to an impending release schedule. Why did they have such a restricted release schedule? They didn't say. Regardless of the reason, it's hard not to feel that Seekers of Adoulin had plenty of wasted potential. Balamor, as a character, could have and perhaps would have been so much more had he been given the proper amount of attention. This is quite analogous, actually, to the remainder of Seekers of Adoulin's final act. It really does feel like a brick was dropped on the accelerator of this story's pacing. Much of the feeling of dread and tension is lost, and certain pivotal reveals are simply glossed over. Despite all of this, Seekers of Adoulin's overall quality in its storytelling does not deviate from the other expansions, and this is a testament to just how well structured the story is overall, despite the awkward pacing in its final act. I remember thinking to myself multiple times during my playthrough that this very well may be my favorite expansion story. The world building, the lovable characters, the villain, the central plot, it was all coming together to give a sense of adventure far beyond what any other expansion story was able to capture. Upon reflection, while this isn't my favorite expansion story, I'd understand if someone claimed it to be theirs. It's just that good. Before I had ever started playing Final Fantasy XI, I listened to most of its soundtracks. I remember finding a couple standout pieces in each expansion, despite not knowing the context of the music. When I got to the soundtrack of Seekers of Adoulin, I found myself listening to every single track, and then I replayed them over and over. While the thematic cohesion found in Wings of the Goddess is notably absent here, this expansion makes up for this by having, in my opinion, the very best melodies of any 11 expansion. From the combat music, to the more subdued pieces, to the final boss fight, every single piece in the soundtrack is incredibly memorable. This soundtrack also serves as a bit of a turning point in the music of 11. By this point, Naoshi Mizuta had been the primary composer for the game for over 10 years, and his added years of experience really show. In addition to the phenomenal style of music he had composed in the past, from this soundtrack onward, he adds certain pieces that are incredibly lyrical. For me, the most beautiful piece of music he has ever written is the piece Forever Today that plays during the ending of this expansion. You'll be hearing that piece before our discussion is over. Believe me, I wouldn't produce a half-hour video essay on Seekers of Adoulin without sneaking that piece in somehow. This new style of his continues in the soundtracks of Rhapsodies of Anadiel and the Voracious Resurgence too, and I just have to say, I couldn't be happier that he stuck with the game for this long. He has continued to produce music that will go down in history as being among the Final Fantasy masterpieces. This expansion does a phenomenal job at integrating many of the narrative components of being a pioneer into the gameplay content throughout. For starters, one of the big parts of the story is the mystical properties of the jungles of Obuka, and when you actually go out and explore the lands, there is truly something special about the zones. Seekers of Adoulin offers a wide variety of biomes, some of which haven't been done in any previous expansion. These zones are gorgeous, and they do offer great rewards for exploration. One reason I really enjoyed these zones is because you can't fully explore the zones until you learn a set of traversal skills that you unlock by doing special quests. Every single time you learn a new traversal skill, such as climbing or using a boat, you gain access to more portions of the zones you've previously visited, so exploring these zones while I progressed the expansion always felt new. One of my favorite moments in the expansion was the first time I got to Recreational. After spending hours collecting the survival skills and exploring the primitive, uninhabited lands of Obuka, walking up to the cube-shaped entrance of Recreational is so jarring, to say the least. Zoning into Recreational feels like you're taken into a completely different world. The massive constructions all throughout that structure are dramatically different from everything else you've seen, and it only gets crazier the further you go. Learning that this labyrinth is the very place that the Founder King died just adds so much more to this experience. In addition to these new zones, Seekers of Adoulin gave 2 new jobs in the form of Rune Fencer and Geomancer. Rune Fencer is a tank that's particularly good at mitigating magic damage. This job is also quite flexible in that it's possible to get a lot of damage output out of it, despite its status as a tank. The second job, Geomancer, has been an integral part of the endgame meta, thanks to its effectiveness at supporting a team. This job also requires players to explore the world for its magical arsenal, much like Summoner and Blue Mage, which is something that I appreciated. One way in which Final Fantasy fans like to understand the series is by dividing it up into different eras. Likewise, dividing up the Final Fantasy XI expansions into distinct eras can also shed light on how precisely Square Enix handled the game at different portions of its life. How best to divide up the expansions will forever be a topic of debate, but for the sake of this video, I've divided them up in this manner. When the game first went into development, work began on both the base game and Rise of the Zilart, so we can classify them as the launch age of the game. If you're wanting a different classification on the time period, we can also call this the base age because all of the content released at this time was developed as the base experience for the game. Rise of the Zilart was a transitionary expansion though, because it set up for the first expansion whose development had not started with the base content. While Chains of Promathia was planned from the beginning, its development started sometime after that of the previous expansions. This period following the conclusion of Rise of the Zilart is what can be referred to as the golden age of Final Fantasy XI for two reasons. Firstly, this was the most lively and vivacious portion of XI's entire life cycle. It had by far more players during this time than at any other time in its life. Secondly, the game was getting a lot of content on a relatively stable release schedule. This period was made up exclusively of expansions, so I've dubbed this era the expansion era of Final Fantasy XI. Wings of the Goddess was the second transitional expansion for XI. The design philosophy of the game had fundamentally shifted away from delivering full expansion experiences over the course of a couple months towards delivering small, self-contained pieces of add-on content. Wings of the Goddess would serve as the primary expansion for the next couple years, and players would see the release of 6 different add-ons. One fundamental issue players had with the add-ons, especially the Abyssia add-ons, was that they were quite reductive. The game had significantly more endgame content before Abyssia than it did after Abyssia, and with the release of each new add-on and content piece, more and more gear became invalidated. It's important to note that Final Fantasy XIV was slated to come out in the middle of this period. So much of what was being done in this game seemed like an attempt on the developer's part to find how both 11 and 14 could coexist. For this reason, I've called this time period the experimental age. And because all of the content aside from the transitional expansion were add-ons, we can refer to this as the add-on era of 11. Finally, Seekers of Adoulin comes out of nowhere to significantly change the game once more. It's important to note that Seekers of Adoulin made the same mistake that Abyssia did. Much of the content in Abyssia had been invalidated once more as a result of the introduction of eye-level gear. But one slight difference between the two eras is that the systems introduced later in the expansion's life cycle are still highly relevant today. And rather than invalidating these systems in later content, the game has built off this foundation for the last 10 years. Because we've never left this time period of 11, I've dubbed it the Modern Age, and the majority of the content of this Modern Age has been delivered through mini-expansions, as opposed to full expansions or the add-ons in previous eras. Alright, the reason I've explained these eras is actually because it is in fact important for you to know that Seekers of Adoulin is in the modern era. As such, the combat content is significantly harder. In previous expansions, it was easy to either out-level content or out-gear content to make playing the content easier. Because Seekers of Adoulin is in the modern era, getting a good handle on its gameplay content requires a little more effort. So as I discuss the gameplay additions in this expansion, you should know that I haven't spent enough time in any of these content pieces to have a solid understanding of what it does well or where it fails. But I will do my best to offer an explanation of the content and discuss how most of it is still highly relevant today. The first piece of content I want to discuss is an activity called reeves, which are essentially what pioneers came to Ulbuka to do. There are 3 types. Colonization reeves involve you going into the jungle and clearing paths of any obstructions. Lair reeves tasks you with finding the lair of dangerous monster types and clearing them out. The last is called Wildskeeper reeves, which pits players against the very Naquals that the founder king had subjugated centuries past. As mentioned before, I loved the lore surrounding these Naquals, so it was an incredible treat to go up against them in fights that are actually really difficult without the help of well-geared players anyway. Another system introduced ties closely with the reeves, and that is the coalition system. Within the city of Adoulin, there are 6 coalitions responsible for coordinating the colonization efforts, and you as a pioneer can pick up assignments from these coalitions. There is a big variety of activities for you to do when engaging with these coalition assignments, including completing reeves, gathering resources from around the new zones, making deliveries, and so much more. There is a system for upgrading your rank in each of the 6 coalitions as well, and this offers an incredible amount of rewards in many different aspects of gameplay. I want to take a moment to discuss an often hated portion of the coalition system in this expansion. Seekers of Adoulin requires you to make a certain amount of progress with these coalition assignments in order to progress the story. I loved this attribute of the expansion because when the characters reference your competence as a pioneer, it makes sense. You're required, after all, to do coalition assignments. This was something that I took issue with in Treasures of Adoulin, where they reference your involvement as a mercenary, yet the story doesn't require you to engage with any of the content associated with mercenary work. I found this to be ultimately quite immersion-breaking, and thankfully, Seekers of Adoulin doesn't have that issue, but there is still a problem. In order to undertake coalition assignments, you need to wait between 6 and 18 hours between each assignment, depending on how much credit you want for said assignment. While most of the coalition requirements, I feel, are usually easy to meet and actually add to the overall experience, there is one mission early on where you're required to have finished 10 full credit quests, which equates to a time gate of 5.5 days. For most players who never engage with the coalition system until they're trying to progress the story, this is an enormous roadblock. Now, you can do side quests to raise your fame in the city and shorten this time gate considerably. But the most effective side quests at raising your fame amounts to a repetitive cycle of fetch quests that don't add anything to the lore or the story. So while I love the content in the coalition system and how it's used throughout the story, the time getting it does early on was a big issue for me. Next, there is Delve, a piece of battle content that has players battle through Delve zones, which are referred to as fractures. These fractures are split into 3 sections. In the first section, you have to defeat 3 notorious monsters before gaining access to the second. Section 2 has you face just 2 NMs before allowing you to access the Fracture boss, which is the hardest NM in the Fracture. There are ways of rearranging which NM you face and where, but what I've explained so far does give a very basic overview of this content. There are many valuable drops within Delve, and if you didn't get what you wanted, once a Fracture boss is cleared, you can spend a currency dropped by NMs inside that Fracture to purchase drops. Many of these items are what I'll call bridge gear. This gear isn't nearly as good as many alternatives, nor will you be using this gear in the endgame, but they do offer great gear upgrades from the starter gear that you can get in this expansion, and thereby making it very useful as a stepping stone towards ultimate gear sets. The next type of content is Skirmish. Skirmish again places you in alternate versions of zones. Depending on the zone, you are given a certain objective, such as protecting a base from waves of enemies, or defeating all of the NMs inside a group of enemies, and so on. If you complete your primary objective, you are given an item that transports you out, and also a secondary objective for more rewards. There are 2 tiers of difficulty in Skirmish, Normal Skirmish and Alluvian Skirmish, which is a bit more difficult and has better rewards. This content does reward great augmentable bridge gear too. Before moving on, I want to point out all of the content I've mentioned so far is required for building an ultimate weapon for the jobs introduced in this expansion. These weapons are called airgun weapons, and they're essentially just mythic weapons for Geomancer and Rune Fencer. They do have a separate process from the other mythic weapons though, and they tie all of the aforementioned content pieces together into one gameplay loop for this expansion. So while not all of the rewards from the content discussed so far are relevant in the endgame, the content itself still certainly is, thanks to these new mythic weapons. The rest of the combat content in Seekers of Adoulin aren't related to making a new mythic weapon. However, they are still highly relevant, thanks to having plenty of ties with the quests for other pieces of ultimate gear. The first type of content to kick off this second category is Incursion. In Incursion, you're placed in a special zone full of Velk Beastmen, with the objective of taking out 6 NMs for special rewards. This content drops plenty of great bridge gear too, and job-specific capes, which can be useful for certain jobs in the modern endgame. The next battle content is called Vagary, which allows you to fight the Zal Triumvirates from the main story. It splits into 2 types as well. Normal Vagary requires you enter Rekazner using one of the special gates to fight through 3 waves of enemies and then one of the Zals. This rewards phenomenal gear depending on your job. Vagary Battlefields, the second type of Vagary, has you squaring off against just the bosses without the waves of enemies. Vagary Battlefields don't reward players with any drops, but they are a much faster way of doing the Vagary portions of certain quests for building ultimate armor. The third type of battle content is called Sinister Reign. This is by far the most simplistic new battle content, and it allows players to fight characters featured throughout the story of the expansion, with the chance of obtaining valuable drops. While this content isn't a part of any of the quest lines for ultimate gear, it does reward certain drops that are considered best in slot for particular jobs and uses in the entire game. I've saved my favorite new combat content for last, and that is high-tier battlefields. This content allows you to purchase entry items with merit points, and these entry items can be used to enter harder versions of a huge variety of battlefields featured all throughout the previous expansions. To participate in a given battlefield, the story version of that fight needs to have been cleared first. This, in my opinion, was an incredible step to preserve so much of this content and keep it relevant for those working towards modern endgame. High-tier battlefields reward incredible bridge gear and many gear pieces dropped from specific fights. So while farming this content, you'll have a wide variety of great bridge gear pieces to work towards. As I've mentioned, this second category of content is much more involved in the making of other ultimate gear aside from the new mythic weapons. Incursion is still farmed today for certain items used in the NM system that builds Aeonic weapons introduced in the following mini-expansion. Defeating Vagary bosses unlocks the ability to upgrade Empyrean armor, and the high-tier battlefields reward Remtail chapters, which are required for upgrading all of the ultimate armor sets. All of this is to say, for content that is 10 years old, all of it is still integral to modern Final Fantasy XI. Seekers of Adoulin did introduce several forms of recreational content too. The first is called Monstrosity, which allows you to become one of the many monsters in the world of the game, and level it up just like any other job. You'll acquire skills, abilities, and spells as you level up too, and you'll gain a currency which allows you to purchase special rewards. I've mentioned before that you have to be pretty weird not to appreciate having a pet dragon. Well, Monstrosity allows you to be your own pet dragon, and I could not be happier. While this content doesn't exactly reward anything groundbreaking, it was incredibly addictive due to how fun each of the monsters are to level. The second recreational content is called Mog Garden. This allows you to participate in a wide variety of gathering activities. The more you engage with Mog Garden, the more activities and rewards you'll have access to. Both of these content pieces are really sizable additions to the recreational content of 11, and I personally had a ton of fun playing around with both. The last 2 gameplay additions we have to discuss are by far the most important. The first of the 2 is called Unity Concord. This system essentially allows players to join guilds run by notable story NPCs. Unity allows you to exchange a special currency called accolades for a wealth of different rewards. it gives access to powerful trusts, and it allows participation in the Unity NM system. This NM system is like an even more streamlined version of the Hunt Registry, and it provides easy access to near-endgame levels of rewards. To earn accolades, you're required to participate in the other gameplay edition, the Records of Eminence. This is actually a quest log system which guides players through a majority of the notable content, as well as rewards players for doing just about any old and obscure content in the entire game. Records of Eminence rewards both accolades and sparks, another type of currency that can be exchanged for gear of all levels, skill-enhancing books, and much more. The reason these two pieces of content are so important is because they take almost all of the casual content in the game, and they streamline everything for players who engage with these systems. Rather than looking for good gear while you level your first job, you can just buy that gear with sparks. Rather than learning one of the many older NM systems, you can just start participating in the Unity NM system. These two systems alone streamline the entirety of the new player experience. In light of the two gameplay systems we've just discussed, I'm hoping you're able to see it now. To see just how Seekers of Adoulin changed 11. The story was something entirely different from what we've gotten before, and it gave some of the most iconic characters, creatures, and concepts that the game has ever gotten. The music adds an entirely new style to the phenomenal music quality found in the previous expansions. All of the gameplay content is still highly relevant and foundational to the overall experience today. If you think I'm being hyperbolic, well, admittedly, our discussion about the story, the music, and the gameplay are only the beginning of how this expansion changed the game. What I mean when I say that Seekers of Adoulin is a new beginning for 11 is that this expansion made 11 play far more like the rest of the games within the mainline Final Fantasy franchise. Many of the old-school MMO elements of this game were reworked or altogether removed. While there were certain quality-of-life features added in the years following Wings of the Goddess, there were dozens upon dozens more added in Seekers of Adoulin, features such as the alter ego system, which would eventually allow even casual players to solo the entirety of the main story, or fast travel between home points and survival guides, or increasing the base walking speed considerably, or increasing the amount of TP gain from each attack. I could keep going on and on. Playing 11 before Seekers of Adoulin was dramatically different from playing 11 after the completion of this expansion. While I know many will disagree, I feel confident in saying there is no expansion or content piece more transformative for 11 than Seekers of Adoulin. Admittedly, these changes were catastrophic for many players who appreciated the sense of accomplishment the game provided. At one time, doing almost anything required a level of commitment that would be considered hardcore today. To see zones like Sky or Sea required hundreds upon hundreds of hours of playing, and even then, you weren't guaranteed anything. For players who worked hard to achieve these things, having all of this stuff made considerably easier fundamentally changed what the game meant to them. While I understand the frustration at the loss of a game as special as 11 was in the Golden Era, it was solely thanks to these changes that 11 is now enjoyable by a larger audience than it ever was before, and I am part of that larger audience. I can't think of a time in my life where I could have played Classic 11, given its time demands, but thanks to the changes made in Seekers of Adoulin, I've been able to enjoy the main story and a plethora of the casual content, just like I would any other Final Fantasy game in the mainline series. For the last decade, it seems apparent that the developers have been working to unify the entirety of 11's vast collection of content into one experience, and to make that experience accessible to a larger audience. This is the only version of 11 that I've ever known. It's the version of 11 that deeply resonated with me. and it's the version that I believe to be the best experience in the Final Fantasy franchise. Seekers of Adoulin is the very expansion that gave us this version of 11, and I will forever be grateful. This video would not have been possible without the link shell that helped me engage with the Seekers of Adoulin content. In particular, I wanted to thank Kane for all of the help and for answering all of the bootlegged questions I had about 11 during this time. In addition to Kane, I wanted to thank Gwaveth again for helping me with the Zol Triumvirate fights. It was a huge honor to play with you. I want to thank Derek for helping me in both Delve and Incursion, and I want to thank Noitora and Vela for the content they helped me with too. The Joker's Wild link shell has been incredible, and I cannot thank you guys enough for taking in a new player who hardly knew anything about the content I needed help with. You all are truly amazing. Finally, dear viewer, not many people make it to the very end of a video, so to those who are listening, thank you very much.